Howdy folks, welcome to your lecture this evening, which we are going to do via recording. I'm going to be speaking relatively quickly, as is kind of my MO, but feel free to re-listen to the slides along with, obviously, pause the recording at any point so you're going to be able to digest the information more thoroughly. So, what we're talking about tonight is carbohydrates. So obviously this is one of the major macronutrients and it's very important for performance in just about every sport. So we're going to store these carbohydrates in a form known as glycogen, which is a highly branched long string of individual glucose that are bounded to one another. Now, we find glycogen in two major locations in the body. One's inside the muscle and the other is inside of our liver. Now, once it's inside of our muscle, it's not getting out. It's stuck in there thanks to the effects of an enzyme known as hexokinase, which we can see that in our wonderful image bottom center. Now, the liver has a variation on it, also known as glucokinase, where it is not a one-way enzymatic function. In fact, it can go both ways, which is good because we can free up the glycogen out of our liver, which in turn is going to be able to go into the blood and then be able to be utilized by the muscle. Now, when we're exercising, we are going to utilize hormones like cortisol and glucagon to free up glucose from our liver, and anything that we're getting also from digestion. That's not a hormonal effect, but that's going to go ahead and increase our blood glucose, which can then be delivered to our muscles. I'll have the picture in the bottom left. Now, if we work out hard enough or have a genetic predisposition for it, we can cause hypoglycemia, which is a low blood sugar, which is going to negatively affect our performance. Now, on the right, we're going to see how working out at different intensities are going to be depleting our muscle glycogen faster or slower. Obviously, for lower intensities, we can maintain for far longer, but if we're at higher intensities, we are limited on how long our glycogen stores are going to last. On the bottom right, we're going to see how much glucose we're going to be able to free up from our liver depending on what level of exercise intensity we're working at. So if we're working at a higher intensity, we're going to be able to free it up a little bit more so as far as grams per minute. But notice, folks, it takes quite a lot of time for that to really get ramped up in general. Now, when we're giving someone carbohydrates, it's important that we understand the concept known as the glucose index. And this is how rapidly is an individual carbohydrate going to be digested by the body, and then that glucose going to now be inside of our blood. Now, if it's a higher GI carb, it's more rapidly digested, the glucose gets dumped into the bloodstream a lot faster. If it's a lower GI carbohydrate, it's something that takes longer to get inside of the bloodstream. So, depending on what we're trying to do as far as our goals, we want to use things like high GI foods when we're talking about being post-workout in order to help maximize glycogen resynthesis, which we're going to learn about in a few, along with trying to just top off our levels perhaps while we're doing exercise. Now, pre-exercise, you might want to go with a moderate or a high GI just so you can get a little bit more, meaning that last meal a couple hours out. But for the most part, most of us should try and make our source of glucose being those low GI carbohydrate food sources. And if you notice when you look up here, a lot of your low GI carbs are typically going to be foods that have a lot more fiber. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we can work on utilizing carbohydrate intake to optimize our performance. Now, we can definitely say we want to load ourselves with a higher carbohydrate diet when we happen to be pre-competition or we're going through very hard blocks of training. So if we look on the far right, we can see depending on how much carbohydrate, or if we're doing carbohydrates plus protein, we're going to be able to resynthesize carbohydrates at a much faster rate. Now notice, guys, it's not really protein that has a major effect. It's literally how much carbohydrate is going to be the major effect. So notice the difference between 0.8 and 1.2. However, if you do add in some protein, it is going to help enhance your glycogen resynthesis, but you might want to increase your protein or add protein to your post-workout just to help with muscle protein, obviously, synthesis, where we're trying to recover from the damage we've done. Now, how much we're going to load? Well, turns out it's going to be relative to the demands we had with those individuals. So think about the caloric requirements and how many grams of carbohydrate we would have ran through. And we also need to keep in mind limitations of what people are going to have with their diet and how much they can even tolerate with carbohydrates as one large bolus. But we can definitely tell you, if you look down at the bottom right, Our athletes that happen to do a better job at taking in more carbohydrates are going to do a much better job of maintaining their performance and being able to have a much faster output. So it's not just how much glycogen is left, which is the top box, but if you look at the bottom box, we're going to see that individuals on that high carb diet literally covered a much greater distance and had to walk far less in that soccer game. Now, in the days leading up to a major competition, we've got essentially a couple different protocols we can in order to enhance how much glycogen we have. One of which is brutal, and I do not suggest it, but it might be a useful thing if we're trying to make weight or trying to keep ourselves lighter. The other is going to be your kinder, gentler. Now, if we look at the graph down below, we can see that we can go a super low carbohydrate diet for essentially from 7 days to 4 days out of competition, and then go super high the last 3. At the meantime, you're training yourself to really deplete your glycogen, so you're going to get a real big spring forward. Or you can slowly taper back your training intensity as is denoted on the right and slowly step up your carbohydrate intake so that overall you're going to have the best amount of glycogen going into it and be the most comfortable. This is a methodology you're going to want to utilize for something like doing marathon or anything else. Now, when in doubt, we want to make sure that we are always matching our carbohydrate intake to the demands of our athlete. Along with, we want to figure out what type of carbohydrate foods or high carbohydrate foods do they tolerate well whenever they're exercising or during breaks within the action. So, when we're going to have someone do carbs right before exercise, well, in the 3 to 5 hours away, as maybe as short as 2, we want them to have their last meal, which is low in fiber, maybe a little bit of protein, definitely low in fat, and with carbohydrate, because then that food is going to be fully digested, or thoroughly digested at least, and have our glycogen stores topped off. Now, in that 30 to 60 minutes before exercise, we really want to abstain from carbohydrate just for the fact that anything that we do with a large bolus there is going to cause a decline in performance because we're actually going to have a rise in insulin, which is going to drive down our blood sugar. Now, we can definitely tell you that if you have a higher carbohydrate intake, like in the bottom left, you are in turn going to use carbs more as fuel. So if our goal is to get someone to potentially lose more fat mass, you might want to go low carbohydrate diet, but that does not necessitate doing that. Now, if we're going and having people exercise and taking in some form of carbohydrate, on the bottom right, we're seeing a good example of how if you add glucose with fructose, we're going to have a greater overall oxidation rate of calories, meaning that we're literally using it for energy. Now, we might be able to give someone a greater amount of carbohydrates. For example, when you see the center bar where they give them more glucose, but notice there's no change in the glucose oxidation rate because you literally peak out your body's ability to digest. And that's actually what's being shown in the graph up and to the right of literally doesn't matter how much carbohydrate we're giving someone. Yeah, you might be able to ingest it and get it into your bloodstream, but as far as actually breaking it down and using it for energy, your limit is about 1.2 grams per minute. Like you're not going to actually be able to break down much more than that and use it for energy. So if we go over that, that's just extra GI distress along with maybe weight and calories that aren't helping them with their performance. Now, while we're exercising, a lot of things that we need to keep in mind, which is we do have that limitation on how fast the GI system can clear it and get it into our system, so there's only so much we're going to be able to use. So we want to typically go with those high GI, almost simple sugars that we know we're going to be able to easily digest, get into the bloodstream, and are not going to require a lot of effort, such as chewing and or having to worry about maybe GI distress from fiber, protein, or fat that might come along with it. That's why there's a lot of different energy drinks, and I don't mean as in you guys who are doing your monsters and whatever else. I'm referring to like using Gatorade, Powerade, etc. Then there's different energy bars and gels such as like goo packets and otherwise that athletes that are more aerobic in nature will utilize to help with increasing their glucose availability and hence potentially their performance. Now mind you, when we're talking about these strategies, we're talking about going hard playing a sport for well over an hour. We're not talking about being a weekend warrior for 10, 20, 30 minutes. You've got to be going hard in the paint for quite some time. So for your average person, we're not even worrying about this so much. But remember, we only have so many receptors, and because of that, they're going to peak out. Now, the reason you can get more from intaking fructose and glucose, as opposed to glucose alone, is the fact that fructose uses a different transporter inside of your GI than glucose does. Hence why you can top out the glucose, but you still have room for more fructose. Along with, we also have lactate transporters, so you could potentially design a supplement that essentially utilize that, and you'd be able to get in even more calories and specifically carbohydrates that you're going to be able to burn per hour. Now, overall, this intake is going to cause us to shift more towards utilizing carbs for metabolism, and that's fine. Obviously, that's kind of part of the goal here, but at the same time, we do need to keep in mind that this is going to put some distress on the body. So how many calories we have somebody come in, yes, these are good ballpark figures, but you still need to actually use this on your clients or yourself. Don't take this as gospel. Instead, apply it, test it, and see if it works. So this would be going for a long run or playing a scrimmage or something else where you test out these strategies and see if they work or see if they cause GI distress. Because what's the point if we get more carbohydrates in them if they happen to be throwing them back up? Now, after exercise is key, because if we do a better job of getting in carbohydrates immediately after exercise, we're going to be able to increase rapidly how much glycogen we're synthesizing. The body is naturally in a state that is very sensitive to this, because if we look on the right, we've increased the amount of GLUT4 receptors on the cellular surface, literally meaning the individual proteins that help get glucose into the cell. Now, through hard exercise, we've obviously broken down a lot of glucose, so we want to get as much in as possible. Now, when we're taking in these carbs, insulin also is going to have a synergistic effect with bringing even more GLUT4 transporters to the surface, because some of these are actually related to muscle contraction. That's going to be the ones on the left, whereas the ones on the right are related strictly to the insulin signaling. But overall, this is still going to end in glycogen resynthesis, which is the key. Now, we have this rapid phase that happens essentially within the first hour after training. And then after that, it is going to still be occurring for up to the next 24 to 48 hours, but it is far slower. So if we're going to do simple carbs, if we want to do simple sugars, pound some pixie sticks or anything else, post-workout is actually the best time to do that, because you're exploiting this natural glucose sensitivity, and you're going to be partitioning these nutrients more towards your muscles than you are going to be partitioning these nutrients more towards your fat cells. So, we want to get in these carbs as fast as possible, taking in however much our body can handle. Remember, we're not going to really be able to go over a certain resynthesis rate, so you might be able to do a higher bolus relative to your body mass, but at the end of the day, we're not talking about pounding down 500 grams of carbohydrate post-workout, but very hard training. We might be talking 50 to 100 easily to try to optimize this. Adding in a little extra protein is going to help with this resynthesis, but also is more important, really, for helping us with that muscle recovery, which is what we're looking for. And when in doubt, there's pros and cons to doing solid or liquid. Liquid is typically far more rapid. It's a lot easier to take down, but it might not be as palatable, or there might be GI distress associated with putting down a lot of simple sugars, and some people enjoy chewing their food. Go figure. So when in doubt, liquid if we're trying to optimize that recovery, but still having the opportunity for solid foods, especially if we're just trying to make really good behaviors. So we could do a post-workout that is literally a maltodextrin or waxy maize starch with whey protein isolate, or we could eat a banana and have a little bit of chicken. Now, where someone's at on the spectrum of being able to make good nutritional decisions and understanding what are some healthy foods and how to fuel themselves, both have the time and the place, but we're always obviously dealing with the budget of the individual and taste preferences. So, the last thing that I want us to go ahead and talk about, so whenever I get back up in the room, we can have a conversation about your lit review, how it's going, how it might not be going, and then any questions you guys might have on the exam. Thank you guys as always. I really appreciate you dealing with this Audible, and I will see you guys hopefully in a little bit. Remember, feel free to re-listen to the slides because I burned through that material.